Despite not having made any Internet Nobodies content in over 2 years, I can't say my time away had been spent idling. I worked a ton to afford our too expensive apartment. I got into a car accident and ended up upgrading. My girlfriend and I adopted several more cats because 2 just wasn't enough, I guess. I wrote an entire book, The Mercy of Dradnor. The ebook is available for free down below. And we did another move to a different state, this time to Kansas. And one mainstay over the last few years has been my love of retro handhelds. What are retro handhelds? They're handheld emulation devices, usually running either Linux or Android, meant to make emulation accessible to the most casual audiences. I feel like the term is a bit of a misnomer, because to me, retro handhelds imply that they're retro. It's a more marketable term than handheld emulator. The most casual people are going to see, hey, this can play Sonic, without really understanding what it does, something that handheld emulator doesn't quite accommodate. It's like a tabletop convection oven. People are stupid. They don't understand what they are, but you say air fryer, and they'll lose their shit not considering that it's just a fucking oven with a fan. Sorry, that's a tangent for another day. Now, as a disclaimer, this video won't cover my entire history with handhelds as a whole. If it did, we would start here. I feel like that's a pretty common starting point for most people, honestly. But no, for this video, it's going to start here. I had the PSP early on in high school, and soon after I figured out how to jailbreak it and put custom firmware on it. It's an easy process, I don't want to understate that. This was so easy to do that even my technologically lacking mind was able to do it no problem. I loaded it up with emulators and some homebrew games, and I played it basically non-stop. Then I traded it to a buddy who ended up breaking it and giving it back. I recently fixed it and did some hardware mods on it, but, well, they didn't turn out very good. I kind of regret doing what I did. But the screen had stopped working anyways, so the whole thing needed to be pulled apart. Around the time I traded away my PSP, I was given a 3DS for Christmas. I spent so much time with the Virtual Console playing classics from my childhood like Super Mario Bros. 3, and exploring other titles I had never had like the Game Boy Mega Man titles. Obviously, I spent a lot of time with the actual 3DS games as well, Link Between Worlds being one of them. That is such a good game. I loved it when it came out. And I'm sure you saw, this is actually a Link Between Worlds 3DS. Then came the Vita. After years of playing it off and on, I found something amazing. Jailbreaking. I'd always heard that jailbreaking the Vita wasn't possible. That Sony had cracked down hard on it and made it impossible to do after how easy the PSP was to hack. So I was just stuck with, gross, actual Vita games. Which I actually didn't even play that much. I really enjoyed the ports of God of War and Ratchet & Clank 2 on there, so those took up a lot of my time. Metal Gear Solid 2 ran great on here as well. And I would be remiss to not bring up Freedom Wars, incredible Vita game. I'm so glad it's getting a port. But yeah, the Freedom Wars, I played that a lot on here too. I just wish I hadn't lost my save file. But there it was. I took the time to do it, took the time to jailbreak the system that I loved, but never really spent time with, and it reopened the love I have of tinkering. I then hacked the 3DS, hacked the Vitas and 3DSs of coworkers, and I thought that was it for me. Then I came across retro handhelds on YouTube. I want to preface now, I'm not going in depth with anything in this video. This is a pretty brief overview of a lot of different things.
Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. So we've got another video for the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus for you today. This is going to be a starter guide.
Retro Game Core specifically was a big influence for me. His in-depth reviews of the handhelds of the time really fascinated me. Devices especially made to emulate classic games? Well, that sounded awesome. I did my research, which amounted to a little more than watching a bunch of YouTube videos, and I settled upon this. The Retroid Pocket 2 Plus. Equipped with a full left analog stick and a right analog slider, it's able to play anything up to the Sega Dreamcast. I spent a lot of time with PS1 games on it. The 4:3 aspect ratio screen works really well for that. I also spent time with Game Boy games as well, but I found I didn't love the D-pad. Actually, I came to not really like most of the controls on here. The ABXY buttons were a little smaller than I'd prefer, and they have some pretty sharp edges. The second analog being a slider ended up being a huge negative for me as well. Sure, it's usable, and generally the only games I played on here that required it were N64 games in place of the C buttons, but it's not as comfortable to use as a traditional analog. It runs Android as well, so there was a smattering of Android-based games in my catalog, like Stardew Valley and even Minecraft. Speaking of running well, performance was honestly pretty good. It ran most of the games I threw at it, but I also knew to keep my expectations in check. I mentioned earlier it running Dreamcast, and it does. Sonic Adventure runs great, though I'm not familiar enough with the game to really see if there's any issues. And Soul Calibur works great as well, but that's about really all I played. With N64, which is very hit or miss on most devices, whether or not it'll run well, for the most part, games ran pretty good with some tweaking. Ocarina of Time didn't really work out the way I'd wanted it to, but really, that game is pretty lame anyways. Banjo-Kazooie, on the other hand, that game is a banger. I spent quite a bit of time playing it on here. My saves ended up getting lost as I was trying to transfer them to a different device, so that's pretty unfortunate since I did get pretty far, but I'll try again down the road. Since the screen is a 4:3 aspect ratio, I actually don't love it for Game Boy Advance games. There's something about the letterboxing that I just didn't like, so there's black bars on the top and bottom of the screen if I wanted to play in the proper aspect ratio. And of course, it couldn't stop there. I then wanted to get something else. Not as a replacement of the Retroid, but to complement it. Something a little smaller, as the Retroid wasn't quite small enough to comfortably fit in my pocket. And the device I chose was the Mii Mini Plus, a vertical handheld that more so resembles the Game Boy line of devices. No analog stick and inline shoulder buttons, the Mii Mini is a far more humble device. Capable of some PS1 emulation, the Mii Mini became my main handheld for anything smaller scale, like NES titles. I loaded it up with custom firmware called Onion OS, which added so many quality of life improvements that the standard OS just didn't have, like loading straight into a game from being powered off, and the game switcher, which loads save states across games so easily. NES games ran perfectly. At this point, anything could probably run NES games without any issues. Super Nintendo as well, no issues. Even with some of the harder to run games like Yoshi's Island, run without a hitch. I do want to admit, I'm a little sacrilegious with this device. Because of the smaller bezels, I'm not as accepting of pillar boxing or letterboxing, so I play NES and Super Nintendo titles in full 4:3 aspect ratio, which is not how those games are supposed to be played. This build of RetroArch has a hotkey, however, that cycles between different scaling options, so I can try out different ones if I so choose. The stretching with those systems isn't horrible in my opinion, so I can ignore it for not being quote-unquote proper. But for Game Boy and Game Boy Color, that's definitely not an option. Those systems had a 10:9 aspect ratio, which was a lot further off of the 4:3 mark than the two previously mentioned systems, so the games would be far more stretched out. The original Game Boy, as you know, is unique in that it is a monochromatic system, all games running with 4 different shades of green, or white as I generally prefer. RetroArch, like most Game Boy emulators, has the option to colorize games for this system, and with hotkeys, you can play around with which palette is active. I don't have a set one, I just keep going until I find an appropriate one for the game I'm playing. And off-script little correction, RetroArch itself is not an emulator. It is a front end to run other emulators through. I like it, but yeah, it's not an emulator. Just needed to preface that. It's not prefaced when I say it after the fact. Right before buying the Miyoo Mini Plus, I had actually bought another device from Go Retroid, the official Retroid store. The Retroid Pocket Flip. This was meant to be more of an upgrade from the Pocket 2 Plus. Sporting a folding clamshell design, which unfortunately doesn't fold out as far as I'd prefer, it's the first Retroid product to have proper analog triggers and active cooling. It has a 16:9 aspect ratio screen and can play some light GameCube and PS2 titles. But the system I mainly played on there was PSP. Chains of Olympus specifically looked and ran wonderfully on this device. I also need to show Super Monkey Ball Adventure running on here. Hopefully referencing our best performing video will help bring some more attention to this one. I did get a lot of PS1 time on there as well, like I played through Metal Gear Solid during my lunch breaks at work. The analog triggers did very little considering the games that this thing is able to run, GameCube and Dreamcast being the only ones to really benefit from it. But I played GameCube so little on here that it didn't end up mattering to me. Personally, I find the Dolphin UI to be far less enjoyable to use than the one used across DuckStation for PlayStation 1 games, and Aetherus X2 for PS2 games, so it sort of turned me off on it. I did play around with Wind Waker on here, and the game itself ran alright, but I had to run the game at a lower than stock resolution in order to get acceptable performance, not really being able to handle the big games. You may have noticed earlier on that the Flip has dual analog sliders instead of proper joysticks, and, well, they honestly work pretty well. They have reasonably little wiggle, which is important to me as I think wiggle adds inaccuracy to your gameplay, and correct me if I'm wrong since I didn't double check this info, I'm pretty sure they're Hall effect analogs, which shouldn't ever drift and are really good. I know that's a horrible explanation, I'm sorry, just I'm not super into the technical part. But I'll be honest with this, with the ergonomics of this device with the placement of the sliders, it gets uncomfortable to play for longer periods. The device also gets very warm with use, the active cooling doesn't actively cool very well. But for a while, I was happy with my 3 devices. But happiness never lasts. Retroid announced the Pocket 4 and Pocket 4 Pro, and I had to snag one. I told myself that the Pocket Flip wouldn't be replaced, that I'd still use it for PSP games and those of a lighter nature, keeping the 4 to the heavier to emulate titles, and for the most part I stuck with that. I do have a couple of PSP games on the 4 Pro, and a smattering of titles from the lower end devices, but the main game system I've played on here has been the PlayStation 2. I'd say it runs roughly 80% of the PS2 library with a little trouble. I played through the entirety of God of War 1, collecting all of the retro achievements as I went. That was a huge pain in the ass. I ran into a little bug with the Challenge of the Gods achievement not popping the first time, so I had to do the whole thing again. The Ratchet & Clank titles play great as well, but I haven't really made much progress in them. And other titles have been fun to play around with, like God Hand. GameCube works great on here, obviously, but I'll be honest, I haven't touched them much. But I have put a few hours into Mario Sunburn, a hack of Mario Sunshine that makes the base game a little more open world, and I tried out Eclipse, very similar to Sunburn with added levels and some gameplay changes. I tried Super Monkey Ball on here as well, but I ran into the issue of the analog sticks being a little too sensitive, an issue made worse by the controllers not having octagonal gates anymore, so it's hard to get specific angles. This issue is fixed by playing Super Monkey Ball Deluxe, a PS2 port of the GameCube titles in the engine for 2, but it's fully locked at 30 FPS, and I couldn't for the life of me figure out how to increase it, or if you even can. But I will say, this device has been my PS2 baby. While it can't fully play Devil May Cry 3, the first Virgil fight is unplayably slow, it's still pretty solid. And the physical controls of the device feel so good. Because this has turned into a PS2 emulator for me, I downloaded this PS2 boot screen wallpaper app, and it looks super nice. It really adds to the effect. I'm going to delve into tricky territory here a little bit, but it can emulate Switch titles as well. Nothing major, and with how shitty Nintendo has been regarding emulation, I won't show off any of their games. Big games just don't work well. I tried Zelda and Mario, and that was a mixed bag. But for indie titles, this performs great, playing games like Binding of Isaac and Blasphemous almost flawlessly. I did have a controller compatibility issue with Binding of Isaac, but I was able to get around that pretty easily. One of the biggest surprises for me, personally, is that it plays the Switch port of Devil May Cry 3 pretty well. It's not perfect, but considering its emulation on a somewhat budget Android device, it runs well. Funnily enough, the port of Devil May Cry 1 does not run well. I'm not going to show it off though because Switch games eat up just too much storage. Recently, a port of Cemu, the Wii U emulator, was released, and it's not great so far, but Wii U emulation on Android is still very much in its infancy, so the performance will increase over time as strides are made. The only thing being playable so far is DuckTales Remastered, but I've only tried a few games. Yoshi's Woolly World was plagued with graphical issues, and Tropical Freeze just plays way too slowly. I haven't gotten to Vita emulation yet, but I don't see it being that much of an issue for this device, but I just don't know yet. It's also hard to justify when I can already easily acquire almost any Vita game on real hardware with PKGJ. And at that, I was kept at those 4 devices for a while. My girlfriend just wouldn't let me get more. That changed though when Anbernic, a completely different handheld company, announced and later released the long-named Anbernic RG35XX SP, a device in an almost identical form factor to the original Game Boy Advance SP. I got the silver because that's the color of SP I had when I was a kid. Hardware-wise, it's similar to the Mii Mini Plus, so it's not like I can play anything crazy. And frankly, I wouldn't want to. I mostly play GBA games on the SP, with some other systems thrown in sometimes, but this is my GBA device. My Mii U handles the other stuff. The custom OS I have on the SP has special RetroArch overlays preset that emulate the look of Game Boy Advance SP as well, making this a huge nostalgia trip for when I use it. I did complain about the aspect ratio issues with the other devices, and yeah, they could be fixed with the overlays that imitate the look of CRTs or the Game Boy bezels, but it's not something I really like to mess with much. I did have a different OS on this device for a little while called Newly, and it worked fine, but I ended up not liking it, so I changed to Mustard OS. It's a recent change, so I don't really have too much to say about it right now. As of November 2024, that's all I have. The Retroid Pocket 5 and Mini are on the horizon, but I'm not going to pull the trigger on them. I can't afford them right now, for one, and for two, the performance of those devices across the board is only a little bit better than that of the Retroid Pocket 4. They're also limited at this point due to the performance of the emulators available. Development on Aether SX2 has ceased, so it won't improve anymore. Nether SX is a fork that was released and it improves performance a little bit, but there isn't active development going on for it right now. Off script, there's also a third emulator allegedly in the works, but I don't really know anything about it. And I don't need to say anything about Switch emulation, there's been plenty of issues with that recently, I think everyone knows. There's a Mii U SP style device that's been teased for a long time, but now that I have the Anbernic SP, I don't really need it. At this point, I think I'm content for now. Obviously, I want other devices. Like, I've been really interested in a device from a brand called Powkitty, the RGB30, which at this point is pretty outdated, but it has a perfectly square screen, which I thought was pretty nifty. And my beloved Retroid released a 2S, the same form factor as the 2 and the 2 Plus, with 2 Hall Effect analog sticks and a beefier chipset. I mentioned the Pocket Mini earlier, and that would be a cool purchase. A device more fit for GameCube games than the Pocket 4 is. Though, I wish it had the purple color scheme that the Pocket 5 was given. I do want to delve into hardware mods for these at some point as well. There are some really nice looking PlayStation buttons for the Pocket 4 that I want to get at some point, as I mostly play PS2 on there. And the Mii U Mini Plus has a lot of potential for other mods as well. But barring all of that, unless something special comes along, I think I'm good with what I have. I still watch YouTube videos about them sometimes. Russ from Retro Game Core is great. and I've really been enjoying TechDweeb. Both channels will be linked below. They have some of the most entertaining and informative videos regarding new handhelds. Retro handhelds have been an evolution of part of my love of gaming, tweaking with emulators and devices. It started with the PSP, as I remember spending so much time trying to get N64 games to run right on there and having fun even when they didn't work out. On PC too, emulation has always been fun for me when games wouldn't quite work right for whatever reason, trying to figure out why and then asking Matthew if I couldn't get it. It's sometimes more fun setting up a new device or getting a game to work than actually playing the games themselves. And I want to say that the fact that these devices make retro gaming so accessible to the masses is awesome. I want to get an Anbernic SP for my sister at some point, because she loved her SP when she was a kid, and even if she doesn't play it, maybe it'll be cool for her kids to use. I've had coworkers obsess over their handhelds, one actually upgrading to a Steam Deck recently, and hopefully he sticks with it. As for me, I'll keep playing with what I have. A Steam Deck or an ROG Ally could replace everything, but where's the fun in that? I hope you've all enjoyed this little dive into what I've been up to the last few years. If it goes to show that Internet Nobodies had still been on my mind during that time, I had actually started a script for the Retroid Pocket 2, a purchase from 2022. Lots of twos. As I said earlier, recently my girlfriend and I moved, and now I have an office where I'm hopefully going to be more productive with my more creative projects.
E.
I didn't even know it went that low.
E, motherfucker. A, B, C, D.
Oh, okay. E as an elephant, right?
D as in dick.
As in
Okay,
suck my.
Do I have enough orbs to get this Ifrit power, even though I'm starting to not like Ifrit?
Motherfucker, you're not starting to dislike Ifrit. You haven't liked him from the get-go.
Oh, here we go. Grenade launch. Not grenade launcher. Stupid gun. Okay, hold up. Swim. Quickly. It quickly changes the view to the direction that the left analog stick is being pressed.
It's so bad.
Change directions. Up and down inversed analog stick. Oh, Jesus Christ. I love swimming. I love refrigerators.
Yeah, it's so bad. So here's to the next video, whenever that comes. Cheers.